Okay, all set. So, welcome to the Q&A section of this Saturday weekly talk. Just enjoy this moment for a second. Love the sound of birds. I'm hearing the birds a lot. So Michelle, hello Michelle. Michelle asks, will you make this video available to share? I'm thinking Twitter. Yes, that's a great idea. As of now, these are being recorded, and then I edit them and add them into the weekly units. So these, every Saturday the live talk and the Q&As are recorded, and then put into that, weekly unit along with a bunch of other goodies for everybody to enjoy for the week. And but sharing them on Twitter, I also have a YouTube channel that I haven't been on for a while. Probably should upload all of this to those channels as well. It's a good idea. So thank you. I'll do that. Does anyone have any questions about what we just talked about in the live Q&A about comfortable being yourself, or about who are we really, of that nature? One fun question to contemplate is a sort of a philosophical question. If you could ask the universe one question and get a guaranteed answer, what would your question be? Hello, Parker. Okay, I'll speak about the trick ego in just a moment. But to this question, just ask yourself, you don't necessarily have to share the question, but it's just a fun little experiment to ask yourself, if you could have one guaranteed answer to any question you could possibly fathom, what would you ask? When I worked in kitchens, I traveled a lot, and I used to like asking the coworkers this question, just kind of get a feel of like where their minds would go with it. Heard lots of interesting answers. All right, and now into the Q&A. Now that we have some submitted topics, Parker asks to speak about the tricky ego. So that will be first, and then next I will do Pega. If I'm pronouncing that right, I'll speak on yours about the laziness or not willing to do things. The tricky ego. Yeah, it certainly is tricky. There are actually a lot of different definitions to the word ego, a lot of different angles to how do we interpret that word? What does that word mean? For one, each of us, even listening here, has our own set of definitions to every word, including ego. When I first got into these practices, my definition of ego at first was just simply something along the lines of like somebody who's really overconfident and like full of themselves and like a egotistical, right? Like you think of like someone, I don't know, just someone who's like all into themselves. But then, studying it for years now, there's so much more to it. Uh, there's different definitions. There's different angles. One definition of ego is a sense of separation. So anytime we feel separated from anything or anyone else, that's an experience of ego, because the opposite of ego is awakening or realization, enlightenment, which is oneness. So the opposite of oneness is separation. And one way that separation occurs is very often is through judgment. Especially when we identify with various perspectives, like let's say, let's talk about a current one that's happening right now, right? This big debate about to wear a mask or not to wear a mask. So if you have these two sides, and well, maybe there's another third side that says I just don't even care. But let's say we have these two sides. If you identify with the group that says masks are the thing and people that don't wear masks are crazy, or you identify with the other side that says masks are ridiculous and people on the other side are crazy. Well, really, both sides are operating in crazy because separation has occurred. The moment you identify with one side of something, you've separated yourself from the totality, from the everything. Making someone wrong, making one of the other sides wrong, separates us from the totality, from the oneness, from recognizing that regardless of whether, let's say metaphorically speaking, you choose to wear a mask or not, it doesn't, like, on the deeper level, it shouldn't separate us. There should still be love. There should still be compassion and understanding, and, and just a genuine acceptance of what that person believes, even if it makes no sense to us on either side of that equation. If it makes no sense to us, still, our love should go beyond logic and truth. So paying attention to where we separate ourselves, this can also obviously happen in political games, right? You have political sides. Somebody says, oh, I'm this side, and the other person says, oh, I'm that side. Boom, separation is born. This idea that just because you have these beliefs and these ideas and these opinions makes you less than anyone or more than anyone else. Separation. Another way to catch this, there's different ways to catch this too. Another way to catch this is with feelings of being superior or inferior to anyone. Easier said than done sometimes, because these feelings of superiority or inferiority can be very sneaky, especially when, like, you get into spiritual practice. I first definitely had to catch myself with, I would, on the outside, I didn't have a lot going on for me. Like, I was working in a kitchen. I didn't go to college. I made very little money. I didn't have any materialism. So on the outside, it seemed like I wasn't very successful, and I felt diminished in that. I felt less than a lot of people because of that. And when I got into spiritual practice, I, I at first, because I felt diminished, I needed to repair that feeling of diminishment. So I created my spiritual self and my enlightened self, and I was like, well, I may not have any of that stuff, but I'm enlightened, and they're not. All those people that have that stuff are not. So boom, I went from being um, diminished to being superior, because spiritually I'm superior. That's what I was thinking back then. And I'm superior to these people that are lost in materialism and in lust and in ego games, right? In the more obvious ones, in the dramas and the suffering. Um, but that in and of itself was an ego trip of my own. Spiritual ego is a very sneaky and tricky one that we have to catch. Um, because in truth, in enlightenment, in awakening, we are one, we are equal, especially as we start to wake up. Like, just because I have a certain mastery of my practice does not mean that I think of myself in any way higher than anyone else. Honestly, because you just have to catch, though. You have to catch when those feelings of superiority sneak in some way. You have to be really internally aware, alert, and honest, and just listening, watching, and you'll know that it's there because your sense of self fluctuates. When you make yourself feel superior to anyone, whether it's spiritually or it's like on the surface level of like materialism and things in comparison, when you play that game, there is the karmic consequence of the fact that you are now in an unstable space. Because whenever you make yourself up here, you're going to go down. It's guaranteed. You're going to be doing this a lot. Because when you make yourself higher, like let's say spiritually, you make yourself higher than all these random people that you're passing by, and you call them sheep and all of these things. You're making them inferior, which makes you superior. But then you come across somebody like Eckhart, and then you see him as being superior, and now you're inferior. And that's sort of the consequence of playing that game. Whereas if you see everyone exactly as where they're supposed to be, including yourself, including Eckhart, including everyone, there isn't that fluctuation anymore. It's stable, it's secure, it's just at ease and peaceful, which ironically brings you higher up into your practice. So, in comparison, again, it's another sneaky way of the ego, because comparison, in the sense of you're defining who somebody else is or who you are based on the relative comparisons, can be ego. It can also be healthy if you use it with inspiration. If you look at it like, wow, that person's there. I really appreciate, admire, respect where they're at. And now I know it's possible. I'm going to go for that. That's healthy. But when it becomes maybe even competitive, or it becomes uh, you have thoughts of like, oh, they think they're so much, and or whatever, and then they're not. Okay, ego snuck in, judgment snuck in, feeling diminished, and then repairing yourself with superiority has snuck in, and that's all just mind game. And really, now, um, another way to identify when the ego is occurring is that whenever we have that fluctuation of superior, inferior, we're suffering. And suffering is one of like the real powerfully honest uh, reflections of how much ego we're actually experiencing. So, because we can, a lot of times too, especially spiritually, we can have all the right answers conceptually. We can say such elegant and beautiful words of wisdom and truth. But if we're experiencing suffering in our day to day lives, then there are some bits and pieces that are missing, that we haven't fully integrated from our own beautiful thoughts and words. Which again is my intention of this group, to just help zero in on that and really clean up little bits and details so that you can really move beyond all the suffering, because that's the real point of all this, to move past all this suffering, to be fully healed, and just pretty much constantly living in a state of enjoyment and peace, and everything's all good. Life is good, literally. um, so paying attention to your suffering is another way to find if there's ego occurring, because ego, the consequence of there being ego is suffering. So it's like you can use suffering, actually the awareness of suffering, in a sort of backwards way, and you can, what's the word, mechanic, something like reverse engineering. I think that's the word. Reverse engineering is kind of the idea here. So you find where your suffering is, which means being honest, being real. You don't have to tell anybody else, but you have to tell yourself that you're in bits of suffering, and then reverse engineering it. In other words, following it to its source. Where is that suffering coming from? Go into it, look at it, and figure out where it's coming from. And you can follow it to its source, and then you can learn and finally dissolve that pattern so that the suffering no longer comes back. Because that source you're following it back to is some bit of ego that's lurking in the shadows, that's lurking in the unawareness, or in the, what's the word I used before? The blind spot. But it's not easy to find blind spots. So yeah, there's a whole lot more to ego and to the trickiness of it, the cunningness of it. But there are a few pointers there. I'll go on to the next one. Although before I do, Michelle says sheep is simply a term of the unaware. It is a way of observing someone isn't enlightened to truth. Truth is oneness. Yes, beautiful. I definitely agree. Um, on that statement, something to just be really mindful of for all of us, and I've had to catch it myself, is it's a fine line between observing and judgment. A really thin line there, because what can happen, and I'm not saying it's happening for you, but I've caught it in me before, is the moment I say, oh, these sheep, all these people that are just following conditioning and not thinking for themselves and all that, a little bit of resistance in me, a little bit of like irritation for them all being so blind and unconscious, and in that too, there's a little bit of me feeling superior because I'm a shepherd or something versus a sheep. I'm not a sheep, so I feel power, superior. I'm not saying it's happening for you, but this is something I've caught in myself, and it can get us. And it brings up a good point too about how like you can observe unconsciousness, you can observe some in when somebody's unaware, but the split second you identify them with that unawareness, it's become a judgment. The second you attach that unawareness to who they are, it's a judgment, and you've lost your own practice because enlightenment is seeing everything as one. And if you see somebody as being unaware, you kind of, and you identify them as that, you yourself have fallen unaware. Um, Whereas if it's pure, just loving, gentle observation, which is important too, is to recognize like, it's perfect. It is okay when somebody's acting in unawareness or in like reactivity, for example, pain body. It is okay to say that is unconsciousness, that is unawareness. But you'll know whether you're doing it from ego or from presence based on how you're feeling. So it's really important to listen to how we're feeling when we're kind of dancing on that line between that fine line between observation and judgment. Listen to how you're feeling. That will help you discern or determine which one it is. Because if there's judgment, there's always a bit of suffering somewhere inside. And if it is pure loving observation, then you feel that. You feel love. You feel forgiveness. You feel that unconditional love and that acceptance, not only of that individual who's unaware, but of the present moment as a whole, which in this moment is an unaware individual. So yeah, thank you, Michelle, for bringing that up. Oh, we said a few more comments here. Once we reverse engineer and dismantle ego, it can be healthy to use ego to navigate growth. I have compassion for them and desire to help them become more aware. I do agree with judgment becoming a problem to separate others. Beautiful. The one thing I would gently disagree with is that I don't see ego as being valuable in any way. As far as my definition of it, more than likely this is just a bit of a difference in definitions. But my definition of ego is illusion. And the illusion, at the end of the day, like I maybe this isn't what you're referring to, because I think with reverse engineering, identifying ego has potential for growth in that sense. But I've heard some people mention like ego having that we need ego to survive, and that is not true. Not that that's what you're saying, but I've heard other people, since that's been sparked, let me speak on that for just a split second, that you don't need ego to survive. The mind would love for you to believe that, because then it can maintain its power and its existence. But the truth is, no, you don't need the deep definition of ego. You don't need that to survive. You don't need that to be yourself. Ego is the illusionary fear and judgment of not being yourself. Why would you need that? But so when people start to say different like statements of ego, again, remember that everybody has different definitions of these words. And as for us too, it's important we can speak our truth of what our definitions are, but it's also important to recognize that perhaps you guys actually, perhaps we all agree on the same thing. We just have a different definition of these words. So something to keep in mind whenever you're commenting or answering other people's questions, or commenting on things. It's just be real mindful, kind of get to what their definitions of the words are too as you're using yours. But yeah, good points. All right, so the next we'll go into Pega. She has a sort of a topic about laziness or not willing to do things. Laziness. It's a big one. It's a big one, especially, I suppose call it the Western world, but nowadays it's like the Western world is everywhere. But the first thing that comes up for laziness actually is practice. In Japan, there's a practice of doing nothing. It's a revered art. to literally do nothing. Like literally just means like just being, not even being on your phone, not even meditating, because then you're doing something. Literally nothing, which actually also means being. And over, in a more Western sort of mind area, doing nothing is ridiculous. It's inconceivable because it's like wasting. Why would you waste time? Why would you? Why would you not be productive? Why would you be lazy? Uh, Partly because we have this fundamental belief that the most important things to do and to create success is in doing stuff, physical actions, even mental actions, but in doing. And if we're not doing, then we're being lazy, we're lacking. And that's something really important to catch because that's a lot of that's just conditioning of society. It's conditioning of the culture that we were brought up in. But there are cultures that embrace not doing. Like in Japan, not maybe all of Japan, but the more spiritual side of Japan. uh, Also, even the word laziness is sort of a judgment coming from the mind. It's a label that's saying, "Oh, not doing is not acceptable." So it's the mind saying, "What is happening right now, which is nothing, is unacceptable." And become aware of that. Become aware of that feeling and those thoughts that are making you feel guilty for for not doing stuff. That's more important than whether you do or not do anything. Is bring awareness to the experience, to the fear, or to the resistance that's happening. Because if you have this label of laziness in your head, then there's resistance. Maybe I don't know if this is referring to yourself, fear of you being lazy, or maybe it's you're observing somebody else not doing something as being lazy. But either way, there's a resistance to what is, which in that moment is doing nothing. So notice that resistance. That's most important because that's suffering. And then see if you can challenge it a little bit. So if you feel a bit of resistance with doing nothing, then maybe make more time to do nothing. Challenge that a little bit. Sit, meditate. I think this is actually an obstacle why a lot of people don't really make regular meditation practices because they feel like meditation is like doing nothing and it's a waste of time. To the mind, it certainly is. And feels like inactivity and being lazy. Now, the truth of both meditation and the art of doing nothing is actually quite the opposite of unproductive. It's most productive because you're taking care of your mental well being by putting everything down, by pushing, basically like resetting, relaxing, letting go of the stories, of the mental commentaries, of the desire to do, of the to-do list, just putting everything down for a moment, just to enjoy existing, enjoy being. Ironically, it is kind of doing something. It, it's 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 revitalizing, it's healing, it's doing inner work, and it's very important. In fact, if everyone on the planet got this and made more time for just being, for existing, putting down their stories and their problems and all of that more often, and didn't give in to this persistent thought that it's laziness, the world would heal quite a bit. Although ironically, the whole pandemic thing has forced a lot of that. But Yeah, so it's important to pay attention to the feelings of doing nothing, like what comes up for you when you're doing nothing. Time can also be, a strong current in that. We have a very we have a lot of conditioning on with the mental concepts of time. So maybe there's a feeling of time within you, a feeling like, oh, I need to do this next. I need to do that next. I'll feel better after I get this done and that done, which means you're projecting. You're projecting your feeling of completeness, your feeling of to some future moment. And when you do that, it's a never ending game. You never get, that image of the dog with a fishing pole on its back and then the bone is like dangling in front of him or her. And so that poor dog, no matter how fast she runs, is never going to catch it. And that's exactly how deep satisfaction and feeling complete and feeling whole works on the concept of time, because we have our feelings of completion, even enlightenment, realization in some distant future moment rather than right now. And something I've found too is when you really sit and you challenge yourself, if you have a bit of resistance to doing nothing and the mind sneaking in with thoughts of being lazy, and a lot of times those thoughts come from like our parents, conditioning of our parents, the little voice of our mom or dad going like, oh, you need to do this and do that and stop being lazy, or whatever. But when we challenge that and we really just be and we let all that stuff, the thoughts and the emotions come and go like clouds, and we sort of have a meditative practice about it, it turns out so much of these things that we do think are important, that we need to get done on our to do list, are not. Not nearly as important as our mental well being, or as our inner experience, what the popular buzzword right now is mental health. It's a bit more than mental health because we're wanting to put the mental part down even. But uh, yeah, it's a good question, and it's I think it resonates for everyone in different degrees depending on culture and what upbringing we had and things. So thank you for asking. Be comfortable with relaxation. Yes. Maybe, sometimes too, I think perhaps we have this little sneaky belief that we have to earn relaxation, like that we have to like do X, Y, and Z first, then we can relax. Right? We have to be like worthy of it. And it's kind of ironic because enlightenment is living in a state of relaxation. If you want to talk in a more modern way, it's living in a relaxation state to where um, you can still do things, but you're doing things from a place of being, from relaxation, from surrender, from non-resistance. And that actually is enlightenment too. It's like meditation kind of can get you into that place of acceptance, inner awareness, peace. But then enlightenment is going the next step. Live in it. Live in relaxation. Live in the peace and joy. Even bring your being, your not doing, into doing at times. Into whatever, if you want to wash the dishes, bring being into that. So you're not even doing the dishes. You're still meditating. You're still just totally enjoying the experience of the water and the sounds, and the smell, and you bring that into everyday life, that's the chop wood, carry water practice. That's where you start living in meditation. Living in meditation is enlightenment. So, and it's a practice. You'll lose, we lose it at times. That's okay. So perhaps this laziness thing is where you're losing it a little bit. That's good awareness. Jean Zakine, maybe I said that right. In present, pun intended. Good. I'm glad you're here, brother. Is everybody here right now? Right here in this moment? So nice to be in this moment. When we're in this moment, what what problems do we have? Birds are singing. Coffee here. Got oxygen to breathe. It's funny because, like, in so many ways, the practice is incredibly simple. It is so simple, and yet, getting to where you feel it is simple, it's not fair to say that it's simple because it takes tremendous amounts of practice, remembering, remembering to remember, self work, healing, calling ourselves out, philosophy, spiritual study, just on and on. There's so much to it, and yet when you really get in it, it's like, oh, this is way more simple than I thought it would be. Because you thought, yeah, you put the thoughts down, and poof, you're here, you're in it, you're in the source. All right, so I think that concludes our Q&A. Thank you for those two topic questions. Um, just so I'm doing this every week. So thank you for joining in, and maybe I'll see you next week. Next up on the menu for our course is, enjoy the rest of your day. And then tomorrow I'll be releasing the official, unit, the weekly unit, which will have the two recordings. It will have a weekly meditation technique. This week is going to be inner body awareness, just some pointers on how to experience inner body. And then it will also have reflective questions to ask yourself, to meditate on, and it will have weekly practices for you to try to bring into your everyday life. And finally, the Zoom hangout that we do on Fridays to conclude each each weekly unit. On Fridays, we get together as a community on Zoom and we explore the reflection questions and we explore our practice for the week. It's a nice way to end that unit before we begin the next one on Saturdays again. So, in case anyone missed that, because I get that this is it's all kind of a new idea. It's a new concept. I don't really know of anyone creating an interactive online course on Facebook. So it's kind of a random, and there's a lot of variables that I think I want to make sure everybody's aware of. Yeah. So thanks for joining in, and enjoy the rest of your present moment. Until we meet again. Much love.